April 15, 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing, yet its ruins still clung to the faces of the defeated. A spring morning in America carried no sound of artillery, no shriek of planes overhead. Only the quiet shuffle of boots on gravel as a column of German women prisoners was led through the gates of a camp in the American Midwest. Their uniforms, once pressed by the order of a crumbling Reich, now sagged with dust and exhaustion. They carried no rifles, only hollow eyes that had seen too much. What they expected to find on the other side of the wire was a new chapter of humiliation, perhaps cruelty, certainly hunger. What they found instead was something far stranger. A line of steaming mugs, dark liquid swirling inside, the bitter aroma floating through the crisp April air. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the roasted acorns that passed for it back home, not the thin barley water that German civilians had clutched like a memory of better days, but the authentic thing, hot, rich, unapologetically American. Some of the women stared at it as though it were a trick. Others pressed trembling hands to their faces, not sure if tears were appropriate in front of their captors. One reached for the tin mug, lifted it slowly, and after the first cautious sip, whispered in disbelief, "This coffee is heaven." Her voice cracked the silence like a hymn sung after years of drought. For years, these women had been taught to imagine America as a land of decadence and barbarism. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a mongrel nation, materialistic and soulless, ruled by greed and chaos. Yet here, in the unexpected kindness of a breakfast line, came their first fracture of doubt. The guards poured the same coffee for themselves, sipping casually as though it were nothing. To the women, it was everything. A drink that carried the warmth of normal life, a taste of abundance they had forgotten could exist. To understand the depth of that moment, one must imagine their journey. In Germany, the final winter of the war had gnawed at the body like a slow disease. Caloric intake had plummeted to barely 1,200 calories per day for civilians. Meat was rationed to ounces, butter had disappeared, and bread often stretched with sawdust to mimic bulk. Coffee, real coffee, had vanished entirely. In its place came ersatz, a grim substitute made from roasted barley or acorns, sometimes dandelion roots. It was bitter, sour, and thin, a cruel reminder of what was lost. Soldiers and civilians alike drank it not for joy, but for ritual, as if pretending could keep spirits alive. So when these women arrived in America, they did not expect plenty. They expected more starvation dressed in a new uniform. The camp itself was ordinary by American standards. Wooden barracks, wire fences, watchtowers. But to women who had come from bombed-out cities where walls collapsed around sleeping children, it looked strangely intact, even merciful. The air smelled of pine, not smoke. The ground was firm with spring, not cratered by shells. And that morning, the smell of coffee drifted like an uninvited guest into their memories, awakening something dangerously close to longing. Historians estimate that by 1945, over 400,000 German prisoners were held in more than 500 camps across the United States. The majority were men, but among them came groups of women captured in the collapsing territories of the Reich, nurses, auxiliaries, clerks, and those swept into the machinery of war. They arrived expecting vengeance. The Geneva Convention, signed decades earlier, guaranteed humane treatment of prisoners, yet paper promises rarely comforted those who had witnessed the collapse of every human law in Europe. And yet, to their astonishment, the Americans seemed intent on following those rules to the letter. Food, shelter, medical care, even opportunities for education were provided. It felt absurd, almost insulting, to be treated with dignity by the enemy they had been told was inhuman. That first sip of coffee became more than a culinary experience. It became a quiet explosion inside the mind. One woman recalled later in a letter smuggled home that it tasted like a return to humanity, as though the war had briefly paused. Another wrote of her disbelief that sugar was added freely, when in Germany children scraped for crumbs of beet syrup. The women looked at one another across the mess hall, some laughing nervously, others murmuring prayers of thanks. They had prepared themselves for chains. They received cups. Still, suspicion lingered. A few held their mugs but did not drink, convinced it might be poisoned. Years of indoctrination do not dissolve in a morning, but when they watched guards sip the same brew, smacking their lips with the ordinary contentment of men beginning another day, the doubts faltered. Slowly, more lips touched the mugs, more eyes widened, and the ripple of surprise spread like sunlight through clouds. The coffee itself was not extraordinary by American standards. Imported beans from Brazil or Colombia, brewed strong in large steel pots. For the GIs, it was routine. For the prisoners, it was a revelation. One guard later joked that he had never seen anyone cry over breakfast before. In that irony lies a truth. What is ordinary to one side of a war may be miraculous to the other. April 1945 was a month of contradictions. In Europe, the Red Army was storming Berlin, and Hitler prepared for his final days in the bunker. Death marched across the continent in the millions. But in the quiet of America's heartland, a different kind of confrontation was unfolding, not with bullets or bombs, but with generosity. These women, who had lived under a banner that promised them superiority, now faced the unsettling reality that their enemy was offering them kindness. The taste of coffee carried a sharper edge than propaganda could dull. The guards did not linger on sentiment. They filled mugs, handed out bread, moved the line along. For them, it was procedure. But the women carried the moment deep within. Some pressed the mugs to their faces to inhale the steam longer, as though warmth could erase years of cold. Some stared into the liquid, seeing not just coffee, but the shattering of expectations, the quiet birth of questions they dared not voice aloud. If the enemy could give them dignity, what else had been a lie? When the breakfast ended, the women returned to their barracks, still whispering. The words repeated themselves in German accents thick with disbelief. "This coffee is heaven." They laughed at the absurdity, and then fell silent, knowing the irony. Heaven in their culture had been described with golden streets and eternal peace. Here in the wooden barracks of an American camp, it arrived in tin mugs and tasted bittersweet. The story of that morning spread among the prisoners, carried in letters, passed in conversations, remembered long after the war ended. It was more than coffee. It was the first sign that captivity might not be the torment they feared. It was the first sign that their understanding of the world, of enemies, of mercy, of survival, was about to be rewritten. What began with steam rising from mugs would unfold in ways none of them could have predicted. For even as they sipped and whispered, beyond the camp's fences the war raged on, and the full weight of America's abundance had only just begun to reveal itself. The contrast was cruel in its clarity. In Germany, the winter of 1944 had not merely been cold. It had been a season of hunger. Bread was stretched with sawdust or turnip flour, potatoes rotted in damp cellars, and children licked beet syrup from spoons as if it were treasure. Mothers boiled watery soups of nettles and cabbage stalks, while fathers returned from shattered factories, gaunt, clutching ration cards that promised nothing. The black market thrived, but prices were impossible, 3 months' wages for a loaf of rye. People learned to improvise. Acorns roasted until they nearly burned, then ground into a bitter powder that hissed in boiling water. This coffee tasted of soil and ash. Yet in their misery, families pretended it was enough, that ritual could replace substance. For the German women now in America, that memory clung to them like smoke. The camp's mess hall shattered those expectations with casual indifference. When breakfast trays carried thick slices of bread, real butter, and eggs, some of the women froze, staring as though guards might snatch it back. When milk was poured into tin cups, pale and rich, they hesitated, remembering how in Germany even children's rations had been watered down until it tasted like chalk. A guard noticed their disbelief and shrugged. "It's just breakfast." The women exchanged glances. How could the enemy treat what was priceless as ordinary? Statistics tell the story as bluntly as numbers can. By 1944, the average German civilian consumed fewer than 1,200 calories a day. In contrast, American prisoners of war, yes, prisoners, were issued rations that often exceeded 3,000 calories. Bread, meat, potatoes, beans, vegetables, fruit when available, sugar, and always coffee. To the War Department, this was not generosity but compliance. The Geneva Convention required that POWs receive the same food as the detaining power's own troops. For American soldiers, coffee was lifeblood. By extension, so too it became for their captives. Still, memory resisted. One woman later recalled that she refused her first egg, convinced it was bait. Another described shaking so violently with hunger that she ate in silence, terrified it might be her last full meal for months. Slowly, repetition wore down suspicion. Breakfast came again the next morning, and the next, and the next. No punishment followed, no sudden cruelty. The abundance seemed inexhaustible, and that abundance unsettled them more than deprivation ever had. Scarcity had shaped their identities. In wartime Germany, hunger taught discipline and obedience. The Nazi regime used food as a weapon, rewarding loyalty with extra rations and punishing dissent with starvation. Families whispered prayers not for victory, but for bread. To step suddenly into a world where food was not a bargaining chip, but a guarantee, was to step into another universe. The camp fences still stood, but the meals eroded the sense of captivity. For a moment, each sip and bite made them feel almost free. The guards noticed. Some laughed that the Germans ate like wolves. Others remarked at their politeness, waiting, thanking, folding napkins carefully. A sergeant remarked in his diary that they look healthier by the week, a phrase that would have been unimaginable had these women remained in their ruined cities. Farmers in nearby towns, too, observed the irony. German prisoners, well-fed and strong, often labored in fields while letters from Europe spoke of children fainting in schools from hunger. The contrast was so sharp it bred resentment among some Americans, who complained that the enemy ate better than allies in bombed Britain. Yet the policy held. To treat prisoners poorly, officials insisted, would dishonor the United States itself. Among the women, conversations began to shift. At first, whispers of suspicion. They are fattening us up for something. Later, hesitant jokes. Perhaps they want us to return to Germany as advertisements. Then came quiet confessions, gratitude mingled with shame. "It is strange," one woman said, "to eat without fear." Her words carried the weight of years in which every crumb had been counted, every mouthful rationed, every hunger pang politicized. Now the very idea of abundance pressed against their pride, forcing them to reconsider what they had believed about strength and weakness. Coffee remained the symbol at the heart of this transformation. In Germany, even ersatz substitutes had dwindled to nothing. Children had grown up not knowing its taste. Yet here, the guards refilled mugs with mechanical regularity, as though the supply could never run out. One afternoon, when a guard offered a second helping, a prisoner laughed aloud, startling herself. That laugh, recorded by a fellow inmate in a later memoir, was the moment she realized she had survived. Survival was no longer just breathing. It was remembering what pleasure felt like. But abundance also provoked guilt. News trickled into the camp of Germany's collapse. The bombings, the refugees, the skeletal survivors wandering roads. Letters from home spoke of empty markets, of people fighting over crusts. To sit in an American mess hall with coffee, sugar, bread, and meat felt like betrayal. Some women tried to ration their own portions, wrapping food in napkins to save for later, as though punishment must eventually arrive. Others closed their eyes while eating, as if denying the sight might erase the shame. They did not yet understand that this paradox, the coexistence of plenty and loss, would haunt them long after the war. The abundance did not erase fear. Beyond the fences, war still raged. In April 1945, the Red Army closed in on Berlin. In the Pacific, Americans prepared for a bloody invasion of Japan. The women wondered if this abundance was temporary, if the tide of war might sweep them elsewhere. Each meal was consumed with gratitude, but also with the quiet dread that it might be the last. The human body adjusted quickly to nourishment, but the human mind clung to memories of deprivation. Yet day by day, abundance worked its transformation. Faces filled out, eyes brightened, laughter returned. Guards, once faceless symbols of the enemy, became men who poured coffee with bored expressions. Captors became waiters. Prisoners became women, rediscovering the simple dignity of being fed. The war had stolen years, families, illusions. But in America, abundance offered something unexpected. Not victory, not defeat, but a chance to remember what normal life had once meant. It was not a simple gift. With every meal came the question, unspoken but ever present. If the enemy could feed them, what else had they been wrong about? Scarcity had been the lens through which they understood power. Now, abundance threatened to rewrite the narrative. And while the women sipped their coffee, uncertain, wary, still guarded in heart, they knew one thing with growing certainty. Captivity in America was not what they had feared. It was stranger, more complex, and perhaps more dangerous, for it was changing them from the inside out. And as they realized this, something new began to emerge. In the hum of the mess hall, over trays of food that seemed endless, the first questions stirred not of hunger, but of belief. If everything they had been told about America was a lie, what else might crumble next? The coffee had been the first crack. The abundance was prying it wider. What waited beyond that crack would be revealed in time, and it would shake them even more than the taste of heaven in a tin mug. The fences were high, strung with wire that caught the light like brittle threads of ice. But inside those boundaries, life acquired a rhythm that none of the women had expected. The guards unlocked the barracks at dawn, their boots crunching on gravel, and the women filed out into a compound that smelled of earth, pine, and sometimes bacon drifting from the mess hall. They were still prisoners, watched from towers where rifles gleamed. Yet what unfolded within those boundaries often felt less like punishment and more like a strange experiment in humanity. Captivity was supposed to strip them of identity. Instead, the camp began slowly to restore it. Daily life was carved into rituals. The morning meal, heavy with bread and coffee, was followed by roll call. Afterward, work assignments were handed out. Some of the women were sent to farms nearby, harvesting vegetables under the watch of a single guard who often lounged in the shade while they worked. Others were placed in sewing rooms, mending uniforms or stitching together sacks. A few worked in camp kitchens, learning the mechanics of American cooking, astonished at the quantities of ingredients poured into pots without the desperate thrift that had defined every German kitchen. They returned each evening with dirt under their nails, the ache of labor in their shoulders, but also with the undeniable feeling of having been useful rather than discarded. The barracks themselves were rough. Wooden bunks, thin mattresses, the scent of damp wool, but they were intact. No walls collapsed in the night, no roofs gaped open to the sky. Compared to the ruins of Hamburg or Cologne, these plain wooden shelters seemed almost indulgent. Blankets were issued, clean and sufficient. Showers, though rationed by schedule, offered hot water that steamed on winter mornings. It was not luxury, but it was safety, and that safety unsettled them as much as it soothed. To live in security while families back home slept in rubble felt like standing on stolen ground. Letters from Germany were both lifeline and torment. Red Cross deliveries brought envelopes bearing the cramped handwriting of mothers, siblings, and husbands. The words inside were often soaked in despair, descriptions of bombings, hunger, the endless search for coal. A few letters carried news of death, the kind of blunt announcement written in sentences too short for the grief they carried. The women read in silence, sometimes hiding tears under blankets, sometimes whispering prayers that their loved ones might at least be alive. In return, they wrote back, careful not to reveal too much about the abundance they lived in. To describe bacon, butter, and coffee would feel like mockery. So they chose their words carefully, speaking of health, of survival, of patience. Still, some could not resist hinting, I am treated well. Do not worry for me. Between the lines, families understood. The camp did not strip them of culture. Books circulated, some in German, others in English with dictionaries attached. Classes were offered by volunteer teachers, English lessons, basic arithmetic, even lectures on American history. At first, many women refused, muttering that it was propaganda. Yet curiosity eroded defiance. Soon, classrooms filled with prisoners repeating English words awkwardly, stumbling over pronunciations. They read novels and were startled by the freedom of the prose, so unlike the stilted, state-approved literature at home. Education, disguised as pastime, became another fracture in the walls of propaganda. They discovered not monsters, but a culture that valued, even celebrated, learning. Music, too, found its way inside the wire. Harmonicas, fiddles, and even a camp piano provided evenings where voices joined in song. Some sang German folk tunes that reminded them of home. Others attempted American songs picked up from guards' radios, fumbling the lyrics with laughter. These nights blurred the line between captive and captor. Guards sometimes paused outside barracks to listen, smoking quietly while the harmonies drifted into the dark. For a few hours, war receded, and only the universal hunger for melody remained. One testimony later recalled a birthday celebrated within the fences. A woman turned 24, and her comrades baked a makeshift cake from stolen flour and cocoa. They sang, clapped, and presented her with a card decorated in pencil sketches. She cried not from sorrow, but from the shocking realization that life, real life with laughter and candles, still existed even here. That memory, she later confessed, haunted her more than the bombings. It reminded her that captivity had returned to her something war had stolen, the ability to feel joy, yet the abundance and routine did not erase the central conflict. Each kindness amplified the dissonance between belief and reality. They had been taught that Americans were savages, intent on extermination, but every hot shower, every English lesson, every refill of coffee chipped away at that narrative. To admit gratitude felt like betrayal of home. To accept comfort was to question loyalty. Inside the camp, they wrestled with this invisible war, the clash between indoctrination and experience. Barbed wire defined the perimeter, but the real fences were inside their minds. Humor, though hesitant, became a weapon against despair. One woman wrote in a letter later smuggled to Germany, "At this rate, I will return twice the woman I was. They feed us too much." The line was followed by a guilty apology. But it revealed something crucial. Within captivity, laughter had returned. Another anecdote told of a prisoner who asked for a third cup of coffee and received it with a guard's smirk. The man muttering, "You Germans fought half the world. And now you fight me for caffeine." The barracks roared with laughter when the story circulated. Humor had bridged the unlikeliest of divides. As weeks passed, their bodies transformed. The sharp angles of hunger softened into curves of health. Skin regained color. Eyes brightened. Even posture changed. Where once they had hunched like fugitives, they now walked with shoulders back, as though abundance itself had lent them dignity. This transformation was visible, undeniable, and it carried with it a profound danger. If America could restore them so swiftly, what else might it restore? What ideas, what loyalties, what convictions might be undone by life behind these fences? Some guards wondered the same. Reports noted the women's quick adaptation, their eagerness for work, their resilience. They were no longer enemies in appearance, but neighbors in routine. A farmer's wife who saw German women working in her fields later recalled being shocked not by hostility, but by their youth. "They looked like our own daughters," she said. It was the most subversive realization of all, that the enemy, once demonized, could look painfully ordinary. The fences remained. Guards rotated, towers loomed, searchlights swept the compound at night. Yet the heart of captivity was changing. Prisoners who had braced themselves for cruelty were instead confronted with mercy. And that mercy created its own torment, a gnawing conflict that no barbed wire could contain. To survive abundance was easy. To reconcile it with everything they had believed, that was the true battle. The one fought silently in each barrack, in each whispered conversation, in each sip of coffee that tasted too much like kindness. One evening, as the sun set behind the wire, the women watched shadows stretch long across the yard. They were still prisoners, yes, but within them something restless stirred. The war was not yet over. Their homeland was burning. Families starved. Yet here, inside fences built to contain them, they had begun to feel human again. And that was the most dangerous discovery of all. For if fences could not keep out humanity, what else might they fail to keep out? The answer, they sensed, was coming soon, and it would demand far more of them than silence and survival. The transformation did not arrive with thunder. It crept in quietly, through gestures so small they might have been missed if not for the weight they carried. a guard handing out sugar cubes with a shrug, a prisoner returning from farm work holding an apple she had been allowed to keep. A moment when laughter escaped the mess hall and startled even those who produced it. These fragments accumulated, and with each one, the women realized the impossible. Their enemy had begun to resemble something uncomfortably close to neighbors. It was a dangerous realization, for the war still raged across oceans. News reached them in fragments: Berlin under siege, Hitler in his bunker, refugees filling the roads. They remained captives, their homeland in ruins. Yet inside the fences, life slipped toward the ordinary. Coffee at dawn, work during the day, classes in the evening. It was routine, and routine was its own form of seduction. To adapt was survival. To feel comfort was treason to the memory of those starving in Europe. That was the conflict burning quietly within them. The guards themselves were young, many barely older than the prisoners. Some were farm boys from Iowa or Kansas who had never seen Germany, let alone understood its collapse. They treated the women with a mixture of suspicion and casual indifference, as if watching cousins who had stumbled into the wrong yard. One evening, when the women sang German folk songs, a guard leaned against the fence and hummed along, his voice clumsy but earnest. For the prisoners, the moment was both absurd and profound. This was the same uniform that represented their defeat. Yet here it joined their melody instead of silencing it. The barbed wire seemed thinner that night. The culture shock reached beyond food and music. When American newspapers circulated in camp libraries, the women stared at headlines that discussed baseball scores with the same seriousness given to war updates. Radios carried advertisements promising washing machines, automobiles, and something called Coca-Cola. For prisoners who had rationed soap until it dissolved into slivers, such abundance felt unreal. When they were offered bottles of the fizzy drink for the first time, they studied it as though it were medicine. The sweetness was startling, almost aggressive, and some laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks. "They drink this every day?" one whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. The irony was not lost. The empire that had promised them supremacy had given them scarcity, while the enemy they feared lived in unthinking abundance. Slowly, the narrative they had carried from Germany crumbled. Propaganda had promised that Americans were brutes without discipline, incapable of culture. Yet here they were fed, housed, educated, even entertained. It was impossible to reconcile. The cracks widened each time a guard opened a door with courtesy, or each time a farmer's wife sent pie to the work detail. The kindness was not grand. It was not sentimental. It was ordinary, and that ordinariness destroyed the lies more effectively than sermons could have. Still, gratitude was laced with shame. At night, the women whispered in their barracks of families back home, of children eating nettle soup, of fathers lost in rubble. They wondered what their letters sounded like when they wrote, "I am well." Did their mothers read those words with relief, or with anger that they thrived while the homeland collapsed? It was a guilt that gnawed at every bite, every sip of coffee. They learned to carry it quietly, but it never left them. Abundance had given them life, but it had also placed them at war with themselves. Not all encounters were gentle. There were guards who spat insults, who reminded them they were still enemies, who enforced rules with unnecessary bark. These moments reasserted the reality of their captivity. Yet even those confrontations felt strangely hollow, for the larger truth could not be erased. They were not starving, not beaten, not abandoned. Compared to what might have been, the cruelty was muted. And when those harsher guards were rotated out, replaced by others who treated them as simply another duty, the prisoners realized that America's power lay not in hatred, but in the terrifying banality of fairness. The inner shift became visible in letters and testimonies after the war. Women recalled that their first real question was not whether they would survive, but why they were surviving so well. That question lingered in every corner of the camp. Some believed it was strategy, that America wanted to return them as walking advertisements, proof that democracy was kinder than dictatorship. Others believed it was arrogance, that the enemy had so much abundance they could waste it even on captives. But the most unsettling possibility was also the simplest. Perhaps the Americans treated them well not for politics, but because they believed it was right. To accept that meant admitting that morality existed beyond the Reich, and that was a thought as frightening as any punishment. One anecdote spread widely in the camp. A young prisoner collapsed during farm work, overcome by heat. An American farmer carried her into his home, laid her on his wife's sofa, and gave her lemonade. She woke to the sight of lace curtains and children's toys scattered on the floor. For months afterward, she could not stop describing that room. It was not the lemonade, not even the rescue, but the realization that she had been placed, without hesitation, into the domestic heart of an American family. The image of enemy children's toys at her feet shattered something within her, and she confessed she could never again think of Americans as monsters. The conflict sharpened in the final weeks of the war. With Germany collapsing, with letters describing starvation and surrender, the women in American camps faced an unbearable paradox. They had never been safer than in enemy hands. It was a truth too cruel to speak aloud, yet impossible to ignore. The war outside demanded loyalty to a crumbling homeland. The life inside the fences offered dignity from those they were taught to hate. It was not a choice they could resolve. It was a tension they carried in silence. When the war ended in May, bells rang in distant towns, and fireworks lit skies they could not see. The prisoners sat in their barracks, silent. Some wept, others stared at their hands. They were enemies no longer, yet not free. The Americans celebrated victory, and the women wondered what awaited them next. Would they be sent home to ruins or kept longer as laborers? Would their families welcome them, or resent them for having lived in abundance while the Reich starved? Even as the guards congratulated one another, the prisoners felt a chill settle in their bones. Freedom, they realized, might be harder than captivity. Yet one image returned again and again, binding the memory of their captivity into something unforgettable: the coffee. That first sip, the bitterness softened by sugar, had been the beginning of every question, every fracture, every uneasy revelation. It was a drink, yes, but it had also been a mirror, reflecting back to them a truth they could neither deny nor fully embrace: that the line between enemy and human was thinner than barbed wire, and that the real battle was not fought with guns, but with dignity offered in a tin mug. And as the camp prepared for the next chapter, the women carried that memory forward, not knowing what awaited them beyond the fences. But certain of one thing: the war had ended, but the questions it had planted within them had only just begun.